It is good to see everybody here tonight. Again, if you're visiting with us, we're glad that you're here. Give us a chance to meet you and get to know you a little bit better when our service is concluded. Tonight, our summer series continues from the Heroes of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Tonight, our subject is by faith, Moses. And our speaker this evening is Luke Quinn. He is a graduate of the Memphis School of Preaching and the Georgia School of Preaching, and he received his Bachelor in Arts in Bible and Biblical Studies from Amridge University. He is currently pursuing his Master's in Counseling from Amridge University. He is the pulpit minister for the West President Avenue Church of Christ in Greenwood, Mississippi, where he lives with his wife Laura and their 3 children, Aylin, age 4, Luke, age 2, and James, age 1. Beautiful, beautiful little family. I had the privilege of meeting them at the youth retreat, I believe it was year before last, and just really enjoyed listening to Luke present his thoughts on God's Word. If you didn't already know, he and Kaylee Allen are cousins. And so I think you're really going to enjoy what he has to share tonight. So I'm not going to take any more of his time. Luke, come on up and share the word with us.
Good evening. You know, it's funny, most people think that I'm Richard's cousin because I obviously look a lot more like him than I do like Kaylee. But I guess good looks can only run on a few sides of the family. Anyway, I'll start now. In a book published in 1991 by William Strauss and Neil Howe, it's a book called Generations. I thought it was an appropriate way to start off this lesson on the life of Moses. And maybe it won't seem that way when I first read the quote, but I think by the end of it you'll see the connection and see the importance of these ideas for us today. So the book says, in a recent survey, now remember this was written in 1991, in a recent survey, new college graduates listed history as the academic subject whose lessons they found of least use in their daily affairs. In part, this reflects the show-me pragmatism of today's rising generation. Yet, as America embarks on the 1990s, people of all ages feel a disconnection from history. Many have difficulty placing their own thoughts and actions, even their own lives, in a larger story. Now, this was a cultural problem in the 1990s. I think it's a church problem in the 2020s, where the culture now, as a whole, actually potently feels its connection with history because of the let's say, unprecedented things that are going on right now. I think everyone understands we're in a historical time. That's in the culture. But I think that the church is steadily feeling itself to be obsolete and inconsequential. It may be, perhaps, that this has happened before, but the question for us is, why is it happening now? Perhaps one of the most pervasive and problematic views in the church today is that the gospel has already happened. It's over now. We can't live it anymore. We can only read about it. This attitude reflects a misunderstanding, first of all, of the church, and second, of history. We need to understand that history is an ongoing affair, and that the church of Jesus Christ doesn't just exist in heaven, it also exists in history. Each generation must find its place in that history, or else be withdrawn into a bewildered obscurity of a decontextualized faith, cut off from the ongoing divine drama. But perhaps I had this thought, in some way, this is the plight of all Christians in this postmodern era. Perhaps the true source of so many of our problems in the West is not so much the notion that God is dead, but that he lives somewhere else. He's been here once, now he's gone. We, in the centuries subsequent to the first, have simply arrived on the scene too late. The story's already been told. It's over. We missed the telling. The great drama's ended, and we've missed the performance. The actors are gone. The lights are out. The author is now silent. That's what we think. And all we have left is the script. But in our unconscious despair, many of us have pretended that the script is the play. But in doing so, we failed to read it as it was intended. For if one really looks at what the author has left behind, one will realize the play's still going on, and we're now the players. And far from arriving too late, we've arrived in our respective roles at precisely the proper moment. Perhaps you have arrived on the stage for such a time as this. As Shakespeare has it, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. And for some reason, sometimes when we think that once our part is played, once our role is done, then the story ends. And that's not true. For each generation, as Whitman says, the powerful play goes on, and each may contribute a verse. The gospel story has not ended. It continues with us to this day. The great heroes of our faith that you all have been studying over this summer, Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and tonight Moses, are now part of a great cloud of witnesses that looks to us as we look to them. As it says in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith." It's that faith that allows us to look back to the life of Moses for inspiration. And it's that faith which also will carry us forward into our own destiny. Now, in the section about Moses in Hebrews 11, specifically verses 23 through 30, it says this: "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after they had been encircled for 7 days." So you have this whole life in a nutshell, and all the work of Moses, and it's characterized by faith. And if you look at not just the life of Moses, but the lives of these other men in Hebrews 11, you get the idea that essentially what the author is saying is that faith is essentially seeing beyond the present, seeing beyond the pleasures of this life, seeing past the things that you physically see. It's sort of the imaginative human ability to look into the future. It's the same quality, really, which has allowed you to form the dreams of your life. When you're a young person, you dream of being married, you dream of your education, your career, your personal development, your home. Those of you who are older realize that not everything that you planned went according to plan, did it? But because you had the plan, it guided you into the future, right? It was useful. It helps you to get to where you are. So that's the same quality, really, which all of God's people have. Together, we can look into the future of the church, the future of history, the entire universe, really. And we form our actions now in light of that vision. And this is the quality which carried Moses through his life. His faith gave him a vision of the past, back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, past Egypt, past his particular upbringing as a member of Pharaoh's household, past all that, all the way back to where God promised Abraham something very special. This gave him a vision of the past, and because of that, a vision of the future for his people. And that's really what we want today. We want to look into the past. We want to look to the life of Moses and use that example and inspiration to help us form a vision for the future. So, the vision for the future of God's people formed the theme of Moses' life and work. It's really what defines him. It's how we come to know him. It's why we know of him in the first place, because he was caught up in this vision of faith. And our lesson this evening really focuses on that vision more than on Moses himself, because it's what makes his personality vivacious. It's what makes it potent in our lives as well. So this is really more of an examination of how the vision of the future of God's people affected Moses, and not just Moses, but his generation, and how that they, in turn, interacted with and shared that vision with the generations that came after them. Now, I think there's a very great need to study the subject in this particular way, because if you have not noticed, there's a great disconnect between the older and younger generations in the church today and in the culture as a whole. And it's going to be detrimental to the church. It really is. And if we don't find some way to come together, then I fear that our movement, the restoration movement, will become not only obsolete, but non-existent. So to understand the subject in this way is very important, I think. I think it will have some intensely practical applications for us. So to understand it in the way of generational relationships, I'm going to provide a framework for understanding generations and how they relate to each other. Now, I mentioned William Strauss and Neil Howe, a book on generations, and really they've been a part of a very ancient way of viewing how generations interact with each other. So Strauss and Howe map out really the history of the United States particularly, but when they did that, they found a pattern in the characteristics that certain generations share, depending on where they were born throughout the course of history, as well as the way these generations interact with each other. So a generation, if you don't know, I'm sure most of us are familiar with the basic idea, is really a group born about every 20 years. So I'll ask for a raise of hands here as we go through the ones that we are now currently, so you get an idea of what we're talking about. So first of all, we have what's commonly called the GI generation, also called the greatest generation. These people were born, and the numbers are a little bit different depending on who you talk to, between 1901 and 1924, which means the youngest of that generation today would be 97 years old. Out of curiosity, is there anyone born within that framework here, 1901 to 1924? It's very unusual now, of course. You'd have to be, at youngest, 97 years old. All right, the greatest generation. That's one thing we've seen in the last 10 or 20 years, is a lot of them are passing away. It's been very sad for many of us. But these are the World War II veterans, right, for the most part. That's the generation we remember from that period, from the last crisis, so to speak, in our country. Then you have the silent generation. Those were born from 1925 to 1942. Anyone born within that range, 1925 to 42? Yes, we have a few. So you're commonly called the silent generation. You range in age from 79 to 96. President Biden's in that generation, right on the tail end, and my grandfather is too, by the way. Then you have the baby boomers. We all know who you are. You were born from 1943 to 1960. Anyone fit that category? 1943, 1960? Oh, yes, quite a few of you. So you range in age from, say, 61 to 78. President Trump was a baby boomer. He was the first yuppie actually mentioned in the 1991 book. Very interesting. Now, they call the next generation the 13er generation because there wasn't a name for it yet. Now we commonly call them Generation X. So if you were born from 1961 to 1981, more or less, raise your hand. Yeah, there you go. Yes. And then the millennials, that's me, born from around 1982 to 2001. Anyone within that range? Yep. All right. Good job. Generation Z actually wasn't talked about too much in the book because by the time they wrote the book, there were none of them yet. So you've got pretty much, I usually put around 2001, but there are different dates for it, just depending on who you're talking to. So if you were born 2001 or after, raise your hand. I know we've got a few of the kids in here. Good. Generation Z. All right. So you get the idea of what we're talking about. And you can already see, if you've looked around to see who's raising your hands, you know each other, right? I hope. So you can see the differences between each other, and you can see and think about how you guys relate to each other, from the very oldest to the very youngest. And what you see is each of these generations has developed its own character that would help us to recognize it. And I'm going to give you a basic character sketch of baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, and Generation Z. I'll give you the positive and negative. And for Generation Z, we'll have to project a little because they're still pretty young. But I think we could pretty much all agree with these. So if I step on your toes, well, I don't care because you can't fire me. So you've got baby boomers. On the one hand, baby boomers are very idealistic, right? You started the consciousness revolution, right? You guys were very spiritual compared to your elders. You cared about different things. On the other hand, you tend to be somewhat narcissistic, right? Well, I won't ask you if that's right. I'll ask the Generation X people if that's right. So you're the prophets. You're the idealists. Generation X, you're very practical, very practical. Also, on the other hand, somewhat skeptical and nihilistic. And you've been seen that way from youth. You're reactives. You're nomads. Millennials, very civic-minded on the one hand, and on the other hand, somewhat collectivistic and honestly rather sissy. We're the civics, we're the heroes. That's what the Strauss and Howe called us before we had the chance to grow up. Generation Z, very talented, very artistic, and yet I think will most likely be somewhat ineffectual and complacent. You're the adaptives, you're artists. So this is a pattern of generations, these four different archetypes. They say, fit every generational cycle in it. We just go through it again and again. The baby boomers who started the consciousness revolution, you guys existed back, before the Civil War. The people who basically got us into the Civil War were people like you. You were very idealistic. You had your opinions. Same people that really led us into the revolution and kind of guided the young rising generation who made us a free country. They were idealists too, very similar qualities to you. And the amazing thing is that these patterns repeat in cycles not just throughout American history, but throughout history as a whole. And if you look at the scriptures, specifically Exodus and into Joshua and Judges, you find a same cycle. You see, basically, the same cycle in the history of Israel, especially when they come out of Egypt. So I'm going to present this vision of the future that we've been talking about through that lens of looking at Moses and his generation and how he deals with the people that came after him. So in the first place, you have Moses. He's the prophet, right? Obviously, he fits that category more than anything else. He's the idealist. So he's a lot like you baby boomers. So feel proud of yourselves. You know, he changes things. He upsets the present, rather complacent order. That's exactly how God uses him. In Exodus 4, verses 29 through 30, it says that Moses and Aaron gathered together all the elders of the people of Israel, and Aaron speaks the words of the Lord that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and did the signs in the sight of the people. So they gathered everyone together, and all the things Moses said that God told Moses to do, bring them out of Egypt, bring them into the promised land. They're there, and they gather the people together and say, we're going to free you. Like, you shouldn't be in slavery. Let's set ourselves free. That's Moses' mission. So he changes things drastically. He sees how things could be, and he sees how things should be through the eye and vision of faith. And so this is what you see him doing all throughout Israel. All throughout the Exodus, In Exodus 19, 1 through 6, Moses says, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, speaking for God, how I bore you on eagle's wings, I brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice, keep my covenant, you shall be treasured possessions among all peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That's the vision that Moses gave to the people of Israel, a slave nation. He said, you will be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. Completely, radically altered their worldview of themselves. And that's a great thing that generation has done. It's a great thing that the idealists and the prophets can do. On the other hand, he's very zealous for this vision, isn't he? Sometimes even ruthless in carrying it out. If you remember in Exodus 32, specifically 19 through 28, I won't read the whole text for you, but if you want to write some of these references down and read them later on your own, that would be really good. Because if you remember, Moses goes up and he brings the law back down, right? He goes up to the mountain, he meets God, and he's bringing the law down. And in the meantime, the people grow impatient. They make a golden calf. And when he sees them, he smashes the tablets down. He gathers everyone who's on his side, on the Lord's side, to him. And he goes throughout the camps, and it says that day they slew about 3,000 men. So he's very zealous, even ruthless in enforcing the vision. That's always the danger of the idealist, isn't it? Is that the vision really takes over, and it can cause a lot of very extreme things to happen. I'm not saying Moses was wrong in this case. I won't put a judgment where the scriptures have not. But you can see that the vision is all important to Moses, and he enforces it. And that's, it's good, it's what you need. But you have other generations that come after. You have different ways of looking at that same vision. For instance, what about those people who made the golden calf? Maybe we have to do a little bit of imagination for them. But what if some of them were the people who perhaps were a little bit too young to remember the hardships of Egypt? Right? I mean, Moses had the elders of Israel pretty much on his side. They were with him a lot during the freeing of Israel. But there were some people, look at Exodus 16, 2 through 3, and it says that they grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And they said, well, would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. So they're very practical, aren't they? I kind of picture them as maybe more of the Generation X type, kind of reacting against the ideals. It's like, yes, this sounds great. We're going to be God's people, but we're in the desert, and I don't see any food, right? I mean, you could see. I mean, we often use the Israelites complaining as a sort of anti-role model, and we think we would never do that, but it's like, well, maybe not so much. Maybe we'd be just like them. And we can see, you can, if you look closely, you can perhaps see their viewpoint here. They're very practical. They don't wait for Moses' vision of faith to come true. They lose faith in the prophet. And they set about making something happen. So that's when they build the golden calf. And you see the problems that Moses has with that generation. To me, it reminds me very much to be the types of problems that have existed between, say, baby boomers and Generation X. The people who had these strong ideals and the other people who said, well, maybe I don't have the same ideals you do. How do you make that work? How do you keep the vision alive then? How are you supposed to interact with them? So what comes after, the grandchildren's generation, they're a little bit more of a comfort to the prophet, right? You've got Joshua and Caleb. They're the heroes, the civics, the millennials, you might say, although maybe you'd question that application today. But if you look at Joshua and Caleb, who are the next generation for sure, they're younger, much younger than Moses. They believe in Moses' vision, don't they? And they have the youth and the power to carry the vision out. For them, it's not just a matter of faith. It is a matter of sight. I mean, they saw the promised land. They're the ones who took it. Moses could only see it from the mountaintop. So Moses puts his faith not just in the vision, but he has to put his faith in them, in Joshua and Caleb, and has to trust them that they'll carry the vision forward and enact it. He leaves it to them to carry on the vision of the people of God. He joins the great cloud of witnesses as the younger generation steps onto the stage of history. And as they look back to him, so he, from the cloud, looks forward to them and has to trust them. Then come the judges, right? If you go into the book of Judges, you see a new generation that arises, right? This generation was too young to have known the sufferings of Egypt, for sure. And they were too young to have known the wilderness wanderings. They were also too young to have known the conquest of the promised land and all of the victories that God gave to Joshua. So as it says in Joshua 2:10, all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. There's Joshua and his generation. And there arose another generation after them that didn't know God or the work that he had done for Israel. So they may have looked back to Joshua and his generation with awe and seen, oh, they did such great things. They established our country. And yet in their own generation, they have grown quite complacent. It says in Judges 2, verses 11 through 13, that the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. It reminds me of what Solomon said in Proverbs 29:18, where there is no vision, the people perish. That's what's at stake there. It's the same thing that's at stake today. But you see, it starts over again, doesn't it? The next generation of judges, the judges arise, and you see the whole roller cycle. What am I trying to say? What is it? Sometimes you can't think of what to say. Roller coaster, that's it. The whole roller coaster of Israel's history, right? They go up and down, to God and away from him. Depending on the judges have to come and save him. So you have the next generation of prophets and idealists that come to the front and say, listen, we shouldn't be living this way. So the cycle continues. And the amazing thing here is that the essence of Moses returns. Moses is a person, a historical person, but he's also in some sense a literary essence, right? Because he shows up constantly throughout the scriptures. And most especially he shows up in the person of Christ. We often call Christ and Moses types and antitypes of each other. That's the same thing as saying that what Moses stood for and was in some sense reincarnated and established in Christ. Or let's say that Moses was a shadow of Christ. So Moses returns along with his vision of faith for the people of God, the vision of God's kingdom coming to earth, a vision which transforms and grows and works its way through the cycle of Israel's history. From Moses to Joshua, later you see it from Eli down to Samuel, from Samuel to David, from David to Solomon, Elijah to Elisha, Jesus to Peter and the apostles, all throughout history, to you. See, this is where I said those things at the beginning, is we need to see this connection between ourselves and this history that we're talking about here. This is still going on, and here we are. Throughout history, the old prophet instructs the young warrior, and later the old warrior encourages the young prophet. And if that doesn't happen, then we're in trouble. The relationship is often strained. And when the relationship is strained between generations, the vision may very well perish from the earth. Remember that question that Jesus asked. It's always frightened me. When the Son of Man returns, will he find faith on the earth? And each generation has to answer that question for themselves. So let's have some applications here to us. One thing about Moses is that he had problems with handing over control. If you remember that section of Scripture in Exodus 18, 13 through 23, which I won't read, it's fairly lengthy, but you can look it up yourself if you want to. Exodus 18, 13 through 23. Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, comes and visits him after they've exited Egypt, and he looks at all the work that Moses has brought onto himself, and he says, you shouldn't be doing all this. I mean, there are capable men in Israel, and you need to delegate some of the power to them. I think it's really an instructive lesson for the people who are in charge of the church today, the prophets and leaders, so to speak, the baby boomer generation for the most part, the people who are for the most part in power and control of things. It's the same problem I've seen, and take this with a grain of salt coming from a millennial, but it does seem as if we have a problem of handing control and power and responsibility, really, to the younger generation. But we have to remember, the prophet can't enter the promised land. That's not your role. You can only see it afar off. It is for the young warriors to obtain the vision. We have to remember that. We talk about faith in this class, and you've talked about it all this summer, I assume. And faith is important. Faith in God, faith in this vision we've been talking about. But what you also have to have is faith in those who come after you. Faith in the church. That's real people. That's me. That's Richard. Those are the kids that Richard teaches. Your sons and daughters, your grandchildren and nephews and nieces. We have to have faith in them. And at some point, we have to let go. And this might be easy for a young man to say, but it is in the nature of things that old things die. Winter turns to spring. Death turns to new life. The crops grow old and they're harvested, and new ones rise in their place. So if we would take an application from these things to the old, I would say, give the young a chance. Give us some responsibility now, before you have no more chances to teach us. Start moving into supporting roles. Don't micromanage the church. Help us to take the place that you currently have. And to the young, I would say this. Try to understand what the vision is. Try to understand your elders and their history, where they come from and the things they experienced and why they view things the way they do. It's really a great application of honor your father and mother. That applies not just to your particular parents, but to the generation in the church that came before you. Honor them. Honor the culture that has given you birth and see why it exists. Don't tear down the ancient landmark before you know why it's there. Try to understand your history, because if you don't have a proper vision of your history, you don't know where you're going to go into the future. That's your roadmap. You look to them and realize that you don't know anything yet. But also, find your place in that history. It's not something that's over and done with. It's only over and done with if you decide it is, because you're the ones who will bring it forward. So take your place. Take responsibility. Don't let the parents and grandparents do everything for you. Ask them to give you something to do. And everyone can do something. So find something to do. Take responsibility for yourself. You're a member of this church here, you young people. You're members here. You're not just the kids. You're just as much a member as anyone else here. And so you have responsibilities too. Now I'm going back to the old people. I would say that in connection to this, to the young people trying to understand the vision, is the older people need to articulate this vision more clearly. Tell us why. Why are we doing this? Why do we meet in this building? Why do we believe the gospel? Why do we have the rules and ideals that we have? Give us something to fight for, not just against, right? That's been a problem for a long time, is that so many of us just, well, we're not this, and that's pretty much all you need to know. You're drawing the negative boundaries. That's not going to carry us forward. That's not a vision for the future. That's an anti-vision. It will only stir destruction. So tell us why. Give us something to fight for. Give us a vision of faith that we can share with you, that we can carry on into the future, because obviously you're not going to be able to forever. The respective generations, now this is important, the respective generations might relate to the vision in different ways, but what's important is that they have the same vision. Now the vision has to be a vision of the past as well as of the future, and one has to inform the other. Moses gave the young generation of Israelites a common vision of the God of their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the promise that God gave to Abraham to give him a place. They were fulfilling that promise. And that's the ideal which Moses was trying to instill in the younger generations. That's the ideal that the younger generation of Joshua and Caleb enacted and established. So they had a common vision of the past, which gave them a common vision for the future. Joshua and Moses related to it differently, but they had the same vision. That's the important thing. That's what we need today. That's what it means to look to the great cloud of witnesses and gaining inspiration from them to look by faith into the future. That's the point. You all, older people, have been in our place. And soon we shall be in yours. And then we too shall go the way of all the earth. Soon everyone in this room will have joined the great cloud of witnesses. How will we honor those who have gone before us? What will we leave to those who will go after us? I want you to think about that for yourself. We generally offer an invitation. I was told I should do so this evening. If you have a need to come forward for any reason, to put on Christ in baptism, or prayers, or whatever it is, I want you to think about that invitation in light of what we've been talking about here. We're going to, I'm sure you know the drill, we're going to stand and sing in just a moment, and anyone that wants to can come forward. And I hope you will respond in some way to these things we've been talking about, and see how the actions that you perform in this life now, as a generation and as an individual, affects the future, even affects the past in some ways, because they're looking to you. So all the work that we see Moses and all those other people have done, will it be destroyed now because of us, our actions or inactions, or will it be continued on into the future? That's our choice. So what are we going to leave to those who go after us? One thing I think we should do is rename Generation Z. Originally, millennials were called Generation Y because they came after Generation X. But Generation Z is the end of the line, right? There aren't any more letters after that. And I don't know about you or if you've thought about this, but I don't think that's a very good sign. Are we unconsciously implying that after Generation Z, our civilization is going to end? Can't our vision of the future of our people look no further than that? Perhaps Generation Z will see the end of our civilization or of many things within it. But perhaps the generation that comes after them can make a new beginning. For if this cyclical understanding of the generations is correct, then the generation that comes after Z will be the next prophets and idealists, the next baby boomers, the next generation of Moses. Perhaps then we can start a new beginning and call them Generation A. Because for us as Christians, regardless of what happens in our civilization, whether it remains or passes away, the Church of Jesus Christ is forever. And that's cause for hope. Our vision of faith lasts to eternity. Each generation must look to the great cloud of witnesses and find its place among them. And so, may we look to the life of Moses and those others as inspiration for our own lives. May we gain a proper vision of the past so that we may obtain a proper vision of the future. May we, in our respective roles, do our duty, both to our forefathers and our progeny, so that when our time comes, we may join the great cloud of witnesses, in whose happy company we shall not be ashamed.